Chapter 8, Political Geography, Key Issue 3, Content Objective. Understand organizations that condone state cooperation and how competition can be a result to cooperation organization. Your I can statements. 7. 1. Describe the principal alliances in Europe, U.S., and Africa during the post-Cold War era. 2. Explain how the Rimland theory and the Heartland theory define political and militaristic alliances during the Cold War. 3. Describe the principal economic alliances in Europe in the period since World War II. 4. Explain the three eras of rapid growth in United Nations membership. 5. Describe the role of the United Nations and what it plays in geopolitical decisions. 6. Compare and contrast unitary federal systems of government. And then lastly, compare and contrast democracy, autocracy, and anocracy types of government. The Heartland and Rimland theory. The Heartland theory goes back to the turn of the 20th century. And the Heartland theory was proposed by a human geographer that stated that controlling Eurasia, so Eastern Europe and Asia, would geopolitically control the world. In other words, control all the resources that would sustain a population to maintain military force to control the whole world. Meanwhile, and again, that theory was used by the Nazis with the conquest to conquer the world geopolitically. The Rimland theory was to counter the Heartland theory. This was proposed by a human geographer, political geographer named Spikeman. Spikeman and Rimland said that if you can control all the oceans surrounding the Heartland, you can control the ports, and thus you control the movement of resources, and thus cut off the resources for amassing military strength. The Rimland theory was used by NATO. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that countered the spread of Russian empire Russian territory after World War II. During World War II, or post-World War II, the world was cast into what is known as a bipolar Cold War era. During this time, we do see the Russians taking on the Heartland theory and then the Rimland theory used by NATO. It goes back to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was post-World War II plan to help rebuild Europe, and it was proposed by Senator Marshall out of the United States, and he proposed that rebuilding Europe would be offered to everyone in Europe. However, Western Europe countries took advantage of his of the congressional offer, and the Eastern European countries declined. With declining of the Marshall Plan, it led to the siding of the Russian superpower, and with that, they'll form a Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact will be in counter of the NATO Pact. Again, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established to stop aggression of Russian territorial expansion. And the Warsaw Pact took Eastern European countries and formed what is known as an Iron Curtain, a buffer from Western European aggression to Russia. Cold War had two superpowers. It was a bipolar world. When we talk about the two superpowers, it was really a time in history where there was non-contiguous territory annexed to their own territory. They had established military bases in other countries that were, again, non-contiguous to their territorial ownership. They controlled bodies of water with naval fleets. They repeatedly threatened military force if necessary. It happened several times throughout history, with Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Then the United States sent troops to the Dominican Republic in 1965, and then they sent troops to Grenada in 1983, and then Panama in 1989. And during this time, instead of major powers joining together to form temporary alliances like we saw previously to World War II, we saw a balance of power, meaning a bipolar world, the two superpowers, as you see right here. Countries either sided with the United States or they sided with the Soviet Union. And this competition, geopolitical competition, formed alliances out of this competition. Those alliances I already mentioned were NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Again, it was established to stop Russian aggression. It was formed mostly by European countries, in addition to the United States and Canada. The Warsaw Pact was used in counter of it, and that took Eastern European countries in forming a military alliance with the Soviet Union to defend attacks, which I already mentioned, forming an Iron Curtain, a buffer from Western European aggression. Other competition that led to alliances are Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, alliance of Southeast Asian countries that have a military alliance, and then CENTO, which is Central Treaty Organization, and those are found in the Western Hemisphere in Central and South America, and that's to stop the spread of communism and Soviet aggression. And then you have currently the Arab League, which is one of the largest supranational alliances, organizations in North Africa and Southwest Asia, where 22 countries are involved in political, militaristic, and social alliances. NATO, as I already mentioned, when we look at the Cold War and setting up the buffer from the invasion of the Soviet Union, the height of the Cold War really was seen in many cases with the Soviet Union secretly planning to construct missile launching sites in Cuba, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK demanded on TV the missiles be removed. He set up a naval blockade, and then there was U.S. Department of Defense had aerial photos clearly showing preparation for them to build these missile launching sites. The Soviet Union quickly diffused the conflict by dismantling the missile launching sites. Again, if you want to learn more about NATO, here's a great video. All right, we can see NATO today, mostly Western European countries. We saw a large number of countries join NATO after the end of the Cold War. So in 1991, several countries joined NATO in the eastern portion of Europe, and several of the countries see it as an important alliance because of Russian aggression, as we already mentioned, with Crimea, annexing Crimea in 2014, and then now a shatter belt found in eastern Ukraine, and then also the sovereignty in jeopardy in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So joining NATO was seen as a lifeline for many of those Eastern European countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union. All right, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. All right, the United Nations. The United Nations was established in 1945 after World War II. It had 51 original members. When it formed, the idea was to rebuild the world. So in 1955, there were 16 countries that joined, mostly European countries, to liberate the Nazis from Germany. And then in 1960, mostly it was former African colonies that now are free or are sovereign from French and British colonial occupation. Some of those countries would have been Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. In 1990 and 1993 was the third era, and that was the break. That's when Balkanization happened in Yugoslavia. So many of the countries that Balkanized, that broke along nationality and ethnic lines, formed sovereign countries, and then they joined the United Nations, and then also in the Soviet Union with 15 republics that that went through devolution, the breakdown of a state into smaller states. You had 15 countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. The United Nations wasn't the first attempt at world organization for peace. There was an attempt with the League of Nations. However, the League of Nations failed because the U.S. never signed. They proposed the League of Nations but never signed the League of Nations, and it proved to be ineffective in preventing a World War II. So the United Nations is the first really successful world organization in modern history, where today we have over 193 countries that are listed as members to the United Nations. Keep in mind the United Nations tries to maintain strict neutrality in any issues. They also have a permanent council of 5 members: China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States. There have been many instances where the United Nations has had to use troops. However, that's a weakness of the United Nations because they have to ask for troop supply from other countries that are part of United Nations. But throughout history, we've seen United Nations intervene by sending troops, like in Korea, supporting the South Koreans in 1950s. And then most recently, we see it with China and Russia as Security Council members that are blocking any international community to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Keep in mind, the motive of United Nations is multifold, meaning they are more than just keeping peace. They promote international cooperation. They also address global economic problems. They promote human rights, and they provide humanitarian relief. Here's an example of the United Nations troops, blue helmets, sent in the crisis in South Sudan in a peacekeeping effort. These troops are from China, supplying the troops in South Sudan. Take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. As I mentioned, the United Nations has 2 bodies. One is the Security Council. They will pass and veto peacekeeping effort initiatives. They also have the Assembly body, and this is a rotating of members. They make 193 countries. They rotate members, and the rotation is about a third is rotated every 6 years, and you have the Assembly body making deliberate policies, so formulating policies for possible peacekeeping effort initiatives. And I already mentioned the weakness is no standing army, so they rely on stronger militaries from countries that are involved with the United Nations. All right, here's another video on the United Nations. If you want to learn more, we can see the United Nations memberships. You can see the proliferation in the 3 eras. You can see in Sub-Saharan Africa in the 1960s and 70s. And then you can see in the Balkan Peninsula, Yugoslavia, right up here. In Eastern European countries with Central Asian countries joining in the 1990s. And in the 1950s, we should see the European countries. And what country has been historically neutral and recently joined the United Nations? Switzerland. All right, other supranational organizations, we've seen a shift from military motives and alliances in the 20th century to now economic alliances in the world. So the movement in the world is still countries build up military force. However, it's not military alliances that we're seeing in the world. The largest in the world currently is NATO, and European Union has the largest economic alliance in the world. Supranational organizations are more than one country that align for a common purpose or motive. Their motive is economic alliances. It was to rebuild Western Europe after World War II. So rebuild Europe and dissolve nation states within um, countries in Europe. And so the first forming members were Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Western Germany. The European Union today, I can't remember. Um, well, the European Union today recently had um, Brexit, which is the exiting of England and United Kingdom from European Union membership, which happened in 2019. However, we also do see a large number of countries that are waiting for acceptance into the United Nations. ComCon. This was established in the Soviet Union. It was formed in 1949. This was to unite Eastern European countries with the Communist Soviet Union, and it was promote economic. There was economic motives to promote trade and sharing of natural resources. Here we can see the expansion of NATO. All right, and then we can see again the joining of NATO most recently between 1999 and 2018. All right, continuing on with the European Union. The European Union expanded by 12 countries in the 1980s. It expanded to 27 by the 2000s. The European Union again was formed to heal the wounds of World War II. Their main task is to promote economic and political cooperation, as I already mentioned, dissolve nation states. They have the Eurozone, which is integrating Europe's nation states into regional organization into one Eurozone, where they have one central bank called the European Central Bank. This bank is responsible for setting interest rates and minimizing inflation throughout the Eurozone. They also have a currency, the euro, and this is big because the euro will dissolve nation states. They'll dissolve nation state currencies such as the French franc and the German mark and the Italian lira. Those are all symbols of nation states. So they dissolve nation states by eradicating the currency and then replacing it with a euro currency. And with that, they will form a more unified supranational organization in European countries. As you can see, European Union expansion. Again, when we look at this, we can see the growth of European Union from 58 to currently in 2018. We can see possible memberships are found in former Yugoslavian countries that balkanized, such as Serbia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania. Then also Turkey and Eastern Europe. Here's an example of the free movement of people between the countries that are involved in the Eurozone or European Union. One of the things that really spurred on Brexit was the free movement of citizens among EU member countries. And United Kingdom voters in 2016 supported the country's withdrawal because they feel like the future enlargement of these north-south tensions enlarging are possible with the addition of new countries like Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia, and Turkey. Here's an example of the euro. And we can see again, dissolving of nation states with the iconic bridge and replacing it with a unified Europe. All right, other supranational organizations that we see in the world today, we have the OAS, which is the Organization of American States. That's social and cultural and economic and political cooperation. You have Commonwealths of Nations. So commonwealths of the United States like Puerto Rico or United Kingdom and their former colonies in the Pacific Ocean. Africa Unity is the largest in Africa, combining 54 countries economically and culturally. Then you have the APEC, which is the Asian Pacific Economic Alliances. This is the largest economic alliance in Asia. It's 18 countries that open up trading borders and movement of trades and natural resources amongst Asian countries. And then you have CARICOM, which is one of the largest in South um, America, which you can see on the right here. And then CARICOM is Caribbean Economic and Cultural Cooperation. I'm sorry, of the Caribbean Ocean. You can see others that are formed here within Brazil as supranational organizations. Supranational organization also we see with ECOWAS, which is Economic Cooperation of Western African Countries. Again, this merger is economic and cultural and political alliances mostly. Again, we can see what's happening in the world. We're seeing the movement from military alliances to economic alliances. All right, and then in the West, North America, we have NAFTA, which has been renamed the USMC, the United States Mexico-Canadian America Agreement. This is free trade and movement of goods along the borders of Mexico, U.S., and Canada. The result has been an uneven exchange economically with maquiladoras that dot the border across the Rio Grande River to the south of the United States, offer cheap labor for producing manufactured output. And many Americans feel as though they're stripping secondary manufacturing jobs from Americans in fair wages. All right. Here's regional economic divisions in Italy. So we see possible devolution within Italy itself into northern and southern regions. We can see that in the northern regions, economically, they're more stable, and in the south, they're less economically stable. Again, these economic disparities can lead to devolution, a breakdown of a state into smaller states. All right, we can look at Spain as well, and we can see Catalonia, that is a region that economically is robust compared to other regions of Spain. And with the Catalan movement, a separatist movement, this could be an area where devolution is possible because of economic disparities with this region and other regions. When we look at Catalan region, it accounts for 1/5 of Spain's economy, industrial and banking centers. All right, other possible devolutionary forces at hand in Russian Federation. You have those isolated regions, which we already talked about, along the Volga River and the Ural Mountains right here, and then also bordering states like in Caucasus region. These are regions that possibly see, and then other bordering regions down here. And these are regions that we see economic disparity and economic viability that promotes a separation between other regions of Russia. And again, these can be devolutionary forces when you have a disparity in economic growth and economic viability. It could lead to devolution, the breakdown of states into smaller states. All right, take a moment to reflect on these summative questions. All right, continuing on, we have types of governments, and here are, we'll talk about the birth of democracy, and watch the video if you want to learn more. When we talk about government types, there are 3 types we see in the world. Democracy. Democracy is formed by 3 factors. That's the selection of leaders, the balance of power, and then also constituents vote on legislative or lawmaking bodies. And then there's also one other factor, and that is the Bill of Rights or liberties provided to the people. Autocracy is a government that limits all those. Citizens do not elect their leaders. Leaders are inherited through heritage of a country. These countries often are synonymous with dictatorships. and citizens or elected leaders are not chosen by constituents, and they also have limited individual liberties. Anocracy is a blend, so it falls in the middle of autocracy and democracy. Countries often go along this continuum. They start with autocracies and move through anocracies and finally to democracies. And we can see that these countries in the world are countries that have mixes in areas of the world where we see a lot of anocracies would be Eastern Europe. You guys stay out for 10 minutes, please. All right, sorry about that. And here we have a list that shows democracies and autocracies. Again, selections of leaders, constituent participation, and checks and balance. And then checks and balance are with civil liberties. All right, is democracy dying? Not according to your textbook. We can see regime types in the world. Look at democracies of 2017. And we can also see where we see autocracies in the world in Eastern Europe, or where we see, again, if we remember back to religions unit, we can see in this area of the world we have non-secular countries where they intertwine government and religion. And then in the West, we can see, wherever we see blue, these countries are going to be countries that religiously, they are secular. They separate church or religion from government, state, federal, national government. We have failed states like Somalia and Haiti because of poverty conditions, which we'll talk about in agriculture. All right, and again, looking at democracy and less autocratic since the 1980s, we can see democracies are on the rise. Other types of governments we have are systems of governments. Also, these are known as local and national governments. You have to know both for the test. You have types of governments, which we talked about with autocracy, anocracy, and democracy. Now you need to know systems of government. So these are local levels of government. Unitary governments do not have much local government control at all. They have minimized local government control, and most of the control is from the central government. Unitary states are formerly nation states. So states of Europe would have been unitary governments. When we look at federal governments, we can see that federal governments are comprised of a national government and state governments and local governments. So the power is distributed to each of those three levels within a federal state. Most of the world's largest states are federal governments, including Russia, Canada, Brazil, India, and the United States. In the United States, in fact, we have a 10th Amendment that gives each state the right powers that's not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved rights to states. So again, anything that's not in the U.S. Constitution is reserved rights to the states, and we can see that with like seatbelt law, speed limit of highways, etc. Here we look at the state fragility. State fragility index shows that countries that are orange are of high stability, meaning when we look at the fairness of the legal system, youth unemployment, level of violence, and freedom to express diverse political views are the most fragile states. And as we see in this map, are sub-Saharan Africa. However, where we see yellow, that means they're experiencing one of these problems: fairness in the legal system, so the criminal justice system, or they have an extent of youth unemployment, or they have a level of violence that's exceedingly high, and they also limit diverse political viewpoints. Take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. All right, continuing on with democracies and autocracies, key elements: selections of leaders. Democracies, the citizens choose their leaders. Autocracies, it's hereditary. That's a lineage, family lineage, usually the political elite. Citizen participation. Democracies have constraints in the use of power they can execute. Citizens' participation can restrict or suppress. or can be repressed in autocracies. So, in other words, in democracies, if in the United States, if we want to vote out a leader, the constituents with a majority vote can vote out constituents, or they can even petition to oust a political member. They also have checks and balances. So checks and balances are the civil liberties given to the citizens. In the United States, it's known as our Bill of Rights, which are 27 Bill of Rights that we want to protect. And then in autocracies, they don't have any meaningful checks and balances. So they don't have the three branches of government that check one another. They don't have civil liberties offered for humans and their rights within the government. In general, we see democratic in the 19th century. We see challenges in the 21st century. Challenges would be populism or nationalism because of unregulated social media. And it's led to the rise of some autocratic leaders in India, Philippines, Brazil, and Turkey. Here's a look at autocracies, anocracies, and democracies. All right, we can see nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons amassed during with the Cold War has led to the proliferation of many nuclear weapons abroad. However, there's been control of nuclear weapons with several laws that have been passed. When we look at the distribution, by and large, Russia and the United States have the most nuclear warheads of any country in the world, but it's declined sharply. Together, U.S. and Russia control 92% of the world's total nuclear weapon heads. Although there are other countries that have it, as you can see listed below. And yeah. All right. Again, we can see the regime types. So you have democratic states that have about half of the nuclear warheads. Then you have the other half in what are autocratic governments. One thing to keep in mind, really only 5 countries, India, Israel, Pakistan, and South Korea, are countries that we've seen concern about in the last decade or so, because there was a Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons that was proposed in 1970. It was signed by 191 countries. This prevented the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. 5 nuclear weapon states agreed to share their nuclear technology for peaceful means. And so when they spread for peaceful means, it went to many countries with the exception of India, Israel, Pakistan, South Sudan, and North Korea that North Korea withdrew, but India, Israel, and Pakistan and South Korea never signed the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in the 1970s. Okay, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. What do all these states have in common? These are federal states because they have smaller states and more power to states or local governments. All right, there's a reading, there's a video. All right, and that will take us to the end of these notes.